Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. Good afternoon. On behalf of Kos and Kaos, the Nordic Jewish Network, and the Danish Youth Organization, I want to warmly welcome you and thank you for being here tonight. It's truly encouraging to see so many gathered for real conversation, especially in the midst of a tragic war that has taken far too many lives and caused deep pain on all sides. In times like this, when nuance is often lost and opinions are quickly dismissed, creating space for thoughtful conversation and respectful dialogue is more important than ever. Kos and Kaos was founded in Oslo 8 years ago in response to exactly this trend, where important conversations, particularly around Jewish identity, Israel anti-Semitism, were being shut down rather than opened up. Since then, we've been creating spaces for dialogue, debate, complexity. We're a member-based organization. Everybody can become a member organization, even you in Denmark. And by doing that, you can get involved in our work, and we can make many more debates like this. Every ideas are welcomed. Big thank you to our panelists for being here. It's amazing. Big thank you to the Jewish youth, to the Conservative Ungdomsparti, and to Socialdemokratene for putting all this together. If you have questions afterwards, we'll have time for questions, right, Martin?
Let's see.
Yes? No, we should have. It's all about the dialogue and conversation. So we'll organize that for the end.
Yes.
You just raise your hand. If you want to be anonymous, you can go to our website, kosandkaos.org, and you'll find a questionnaire that you can write, and I'll get the message to my email, and I'll forward it to you. Good luck, and knock yourself out.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much. The debate tonight is about one of the most serious allegations in international law, the question of genocide in the context of the ongoing war in Gaza. And as you know, this is a subject that commands global attention, sparks profound emotion, and raises challenges, legal challenges, moral and political questions. The allegation of genocide comes in the wake of Israel's military operations and war in Gaza launched after the terror attacks in 2023, as you know, and it was made very concrete, not just from demonstrations and chanting and shouting, but by South Africa bringing the case before the International Court of Justice in January 2024, accusing Israel of committing acts of genocide against the Palestinian people. And South Africa alleges that the scale of civilian casualties, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and statements by Israeli officials amount to genocidal intent. Israel strongly rejects these allegations, as you know, arguing that its actions are aimed at dismantling Hamas, a group that has committed acts of terror and is using civilian areas for military purposes. Israel maintains that it operates within the bounds of international law, and so on. The ICJ has issued provisional measures calling on Israel to prevent acts of genocide and to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, but it has not yet ruled on whether genocide has actually occurred. This is what we're going to discuss. My name is Martin Krasnik. I'm normally very engaged in this debate. Today I'm the moderator. Some of you might be relieved that this is the case, but I'm glad to be the moderator. I do think that this is a very, very important debate, and also in this situation, this is a really, really rare and much needed thing. The topic is difficult. It's difficult to discuss. It's politically charged. It has a lot of emotions involved. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been an event like this in Copenhagen for the last almost 1.5 years, where really engaging the opposite opinion. So thank you very, very much for taking part in it. It's extremely important. and it's equally important to engage in this openly, honestly, and with mutual respect. The idea here is not to agree on everything, but to create a space where people probably, hopefully, will go home more clever and more enlightened. We have a very, as you can see, distinguished panel here today. On the far left, not in any political term, Annette Stubkjær, Policy Adviser at Amnesty International Denmark, and as you know, Amnesty International in December last year concluded that Israel is actually committing genocide in Gaza. Welcome to you. Trine Pertou Mach, member of Parliament for the Social People's Party, SF, the spokesperson. Oh, what did I say? No, did I say SF? Why did I say that? Enhedslisten, sorry about that. But as spokesperson on international relations, and Trine has also claimed that Israel is actually committing genocide. Thank you for coming, Trine. Natasha Hausdorff, a barrister and director at UK Lawyers for Israel, specializes in international law and security policy, and also is known for a strong defense on Israel's legal positions. Christian Vigilius is a former chairman of the Conservative Youth Party.
Young Conservatives.
Yeah, Young Conservatives. A student here in this place. Good for you. And then also a candidate for Parliament. And first, each of you will have 5 minutes to present your opening remarks. And Annette Stubkjær, please go ahead.
Can you all hear me, or should I have a microphone?
You should have a microphone.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting Amnesty International for this debate. I work as a policy advisor in Amnesty International Denmark, and I represent the world's largest human rights organization with among 10 million members globally. And our mandate in Amnesty is to document violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. We use this documentation to hold perpetrators accountable and thereby seeking justice for victims. One of the most important principles for us is universality, meaning that the law should be applied equally to all parties. And as Martin Krasnick said, in December 2024, last year, Amnesty International published a detailed analysis and report concluding that Israel is been and is still committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. And the conclusion is based on intensive investigation by my colleagues into Israel's conduct since the 7th of October 2023 until July 2024, and in-depth legal analysis of previous decisions by international courts on exactly genocide. And we do not come to this conclusion lightly or for any political reasons. We studied Israel's and its government and military actions in Gaza closely and in their totality. And for us, the conclusion is quite clear. Israel has committed 3 out of the 5 acts that is prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Killings, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a group. But the existence of those acts alone is not sufficient to meet the genocide threshold. These acts should be done with the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. We have therefore analyzed more than 100 statements by Israeli government officials, high-ranking military officers, and members of the Knesset. And we found the repeated use of dehumanizing language. We found statements calling for a genocidal act and other crimes under international law. We verified videos of soldiers replicating those narratives, calling for the erasure of Gaza or to make return inhabitable, celebrating the destruction of Palestinian homes, mosques, schools, and university by Israeli soldiers. And I now want to use my 5 minutes to go a bit more detail about why we and how we came to this conclusion. So first on killings and serious bodily injuries. To determine whether Israel has carried out these prohibited acts, we focused on investigations that we have conducted into 15 airstrikes that took place in Gaza between October 2023 and April 2024. Our research found that all of these airstrikes were either direct attacks on civilians or civilian objects or indiscriminate attacks. And these 15 airstrikes alone killed at least 334 people, including at least 141 children, and wounded hundreds of others. And in all but one case, Israel gave no warning before carrying out the attack. And in the last case, although Israel did give a warning, it was not effective. In none of these attacks did we find evidence that there was any legitimate military objective in or near the location that was struck. And one example is an Israeli attack in April last year on Al-Maghazi refugee camp in central Gaza that killed 15 civilians, including 10 children. And this munition landed in the middle of a market street where children were playing around a football table. We reviewed 4 videos and 22 photographs taken by journalists and residents living in that area, and also taken at the scene by our own field workers. And damage from the weapon, the fragments, is visible on the football table, on nearby vehicles, and on the walls of surrounding houses and shops. The pattern of damage at the scene and the electronic components in the recovered fragments match that of a small precision-guided missile and glide bombs that was launched by Israeli drones. And responding in an interview in the CNN, the Israeli military initially said it struck a terror target in Al-Maghazi, but declined to provide any additional details of this event. They later shifted response, saying that they had no record of the strike. The Israeli military also declined to answer questions regarding the nature of the target or whether any fighters were killed. And these 15 airstrikes that we documented are just a few of the actions that attacks that have taken place throughout the last 19 months. Now, viewed in isolation, maybe you could argue that some of these attacks were reckless or careless, but when you view them cumulatively over the course of 9 months that we did, the fact that Israel repeated such deadly attacks on homes, civilian homes and other buildings, and still continues to do so today, in densely populated areas with large explosive weapons, and often at times where people would be at home sleeping during the night, without any effective or any advance warning, indicates deliberateness. And to claim that all of these attacks, done by one of the most technology advanced militaries in the world, that they are mistakes, is highly unlikely. Our conclusion is that these attacks caused deliberate and unlawful death and injuries to Palestinian civilians. They constitute the prohibited acts of killing members of the group and causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. And then to determine whether Israel inflicted conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of Palestinians, we assessed Israel's role in 3 patterns of events in Gaza. Firstly, massive damage and destruction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And second, the repeated mass forced displacement of the vast majority of Gaza's population under inhumane conditions. And thirdly, the obstruction and denial of the delivery of essential services and life-saving supplies into Gaza. After October 2023, the majority of homes in Gaza were damaged and destroyed at unprecedented scale and speed. Gaza's once vibrant domestic agricultural sector, which actually meant a significant portion of people's nutritional needs, before all of this was quickly decimated. And we documented how the Israeli military destroyed large tracts of agricultural land and thousands of homes and other structures along Gaza's eastern perimeter as part of its efforts to expand the buffer zone. 1 minute, oh, okay, needs to be quick. And finally, along with mass destruction and the mass forced displacement that we've seen, the Israeli authorities, they denied and obstructed the delivery of essential services. And as you are all probably aware of, we are right now witnessing a blockade of aid since 2nd of March that has left everyone in Gaza hungry and almost 500,000 people at risk of dying from hunger. Finally, before passing the floor to one of my co-panelists, I want to explain how we in Amnesty came to the conclusion of intent. It is important to first of all understand the context of this. What we are seeing in Gaza right now is occurring in the context of Israel's apartheid system, which subjects all Palestinians within Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory to an institutionalized regime of oppression. And it is occurring in the context of an 18-year-old unlawful blockade of Gaza. And this demonstrates the already pre-existing attitude towards Palestinians. Within weeks of Israel's government's offensive into Gaza, UN special rapporteurs and members of UN working groups, the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, as well as international civil society organizations, raised concerns that the language that is being used dehumanize Palestinians and make them at great risk of genocide. And this was also taken into consideration in ICJ's provisional measures in January last year. So I want to finish by saying that now it is time for us to use the right words, use the right language that we already have, describe what's going on in Gaza. And we believe it's Gaza, we believe it's genocide, and we believe that it is now that we all have to acknowledge this and stop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it takes a British lawyer and a Norwegian NGO to get an open conversation in Denmark on this topic. That's really interesting. But thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm a politician, so I'm not making any legal conclusions or anything. I'm not judging. I'm basing the politics that I suggest on reports, documentations that others are doing. NGOs, the UN system, journalists, so on and so forth. The fundamental thing here, and the fundamental question to me, is that we have international law. It applies to all actors without exception. Nobody can say, I'm outside of that system. You can judge others, you cannot judge me. They go for everyone. All parties in a conflict, no matter where, no matter when. And as a very small country in the world, we are completely dependent on that system, on the rules-based order, on international conventions, on international laws, on agreements on how to wage war, how to regulate. We are completely dependent on that as a small state. Otherwise, we'll be dominated by big powers and their power play. And alongside with that, we are completely dependent on strong international institutions, whether that would be multilateral institutions or legal institutions such as the International Court of Justice and the ICC. So as a small country and as a politician in a small country, I feel very obliged to argue that, because we are ourselves the first to lose if that system falls apart. And I think we're at a very critical point in time in international history where this system is under attack from a lot of different sides. We have seen Russia being very aggressive for a very long time. We see the US, and we also see Israel attacking that system, and many others. So just to mention three. The situation in Gaza is not just a humanitarian catastrophe. It's a man-made humanitarian catastrophe, and that's why it takes up so much time and attention also in Danish politics. When we look at the reports coming out, the documentation coming out of Gaza, including Amnesty, but also a lot of others, We see human destruction to a scale we haven't witnessed for many, many years. We see what seems to be deliberate attacks on the humanitarian actors, indiscriminate killings, destruction of civilian housing, mosques, churches, infrastructure, and attacks on journalists. So on these very many dimensions whereby we usually judge warfare, we see the way Israel is waging its war on the wrong side of that set of regulations. Many institutions have been documenting that, coming to different conclusions. Some do not conclude, they just share the documentation, the statistics on the very many thousand people being killed. And then we have organizations actually drawing conclusions based on evidence they've been gathering for a very long time. And in this specific conflict, it's a very brave move to make, I would have to say. So how does a politician like myself act on all that knowledge? Well, I think, as I said, Denmark, as a very small country, being very dependent on that international system, we have to speak up when we see it being under attack. And I think we also have an obligation to act. Denmark has signed the Convention on Genocide, which obliges us to act to prevent a genocide from happening. And the fact that there is now a court case that hasn't come to any conclusions, but there is a court case at the International Court of Justice that relates to a potential genocide in Palestine, I think Denmark and other countries in the world would have to act on that. Not because we conclude, because it's not politicians' job to be conclusive on this, but because we have to live up to our obligations of prevention. And we can only prevent something from happening if we act in due time. And that due time is now. So I've spent the last 20 months raising questions to the Danish government, calling ministers into committee meetings to answer why we continue to export weapons, why we continue to have the association agreement at EU level, bilateral trade with Israel, how the Danish government will act in the UN Security Council, so on and so forth. Because I think we have a self-interest in it, but also because we have an obligation to stand up for human rights and international law when we see it completely under attack. Now that would be my conclusion. What we have is not a long list of conclusions, but we have dire reports documenting what they have been finding. Amnesty for genocide, UN reports, other humanitarian organizations reports documenting collective punishment, using hunger as a weapon against a whole people, talks about ethnic cleansing, and the whole lot. So for me as a politician, I think it's completely in due time to act on that knowledge. And that is what I think politicians should be doing, because no state in this world can be left outside that system of regulation. All states have to follow regulations on war, international humanitarian law, international conventions, and so on. And we have to act now before it's too late, because we have an obligation to prevent. And that's why I think acting on the language that does exist, using the structures and the systems and the institutions that we do have, brings me to a conclusion also to use the language of genocide and genocidal war in Gaza. Because I think we have to use the language that is the conclusion from the actions that we do see. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you, and I am very happy to have come all the way from the United Kingdom to participate in what has unfortunately become an extremely important topic to address. The fact that we are all here to discuss this heinous canard of genocide against the Jewish state is a very problematic thing. We meet, unfortunately, in serious and tragic times, but they are times that have been concretely contributed to by the weaponization of key concepts in international law, genocide included, unfortunately, by civil society as well as politicians and organizations like Amnesty International. The NGO Monitor, in responding to this outrageous false report put out in December, commented that Amnesty consistently uses false and manipulated claims as well as lawfare to shield Hamas and demonize Israel. And only in March 2022, Amnesty USA Director Paul O'Brien said at an event, "We are opposed to the idea, and this I think is an existential part of the debate, that Israel should be preserved as a state for the Jewish people." That has been at the core of the activity that we have seen for many, many years, from Amnesty International, Oxfam, who I believe is also represented in some capacity this evening, and many other NGOs that were set up with lofty ideals and ambitions to preserve international law and to fight injustice wherever it appears. These organizations are now at the core of spreading misinformation and blood libels against the Jewish state. And I want to pick up on just two aspects of what the first speaker commented on. The first was to ensure, she said, that law is applied equally to all parties. Well, this is something that, even in its report, Amnesty clearly does not hold to when it seeks to rewrite the definition of genocide, and I shall come back to that, I hope, in due course in my remarks. But the other comment that was made is that this report consisted of detailed investigations. And I just want to pick up on the methodology of this report, which is perhaps hidden in the small print of it, so that you understand how it is that Amnesty International communicates to us that it has collected this information. Amnesty International also spoke with members of local authorities in Gaza. Who are those local authorities? In other words, Amnesty International obtained information for its report from Hamas. It also indicated that it had received input from another Palestinian terrorist organization, the PFLP. It is quite shocking that this is what the report has been predicated on when one considers the prior reputation of Amnesty International. But when one looks at what this report is geared at, which is support for Hamas, those pieces very much appear to fall into place. Now, I would be here all afternoon/evening if I were to go through chapter and verse of the falsehoods that are contained in this report, but I appreciate our opening statements are time limited. So I will reserve myself simply to a few, including these conclusions that Amnesty International drew, that it did not find any evidence that any of the strikes were directed at military objectives, because that has been repeated to you this evening. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, international law does not work on the basis of the effects-based analysis that was suggested to you by the last speaker. Clearly, I'm afraid that demonstrates a lack of understanding about how international law as a whole, but international humanitarian law in particular, operates. It is not effects-based, it is intention-based. So unless Amnesty International, instead of taking their doctrine from Hamas, had access to the intelligence that Israel has operated on in each and every one of these strikes, it is in no position to make the assessments that it purports to make. Quite the contrary. And in fact, the entities with whom Israel has shared this information, sensitive intelligence that has informed Israel's proportionality analysis, which is critical to a proper application of international humanitarian law, those countries have consistently said they do not have concerns with breaches of international humanitarian law by Israel so far as proportionality and targeting is concerned. And with good reason, because the Israeli Defense Forces consistently go over and above the requirements of international law. And honest military experts and legal ones have been frank about that because of the practices that Israel has put into place. The proportionality analysis, the choice of munitions, the development of smart munitions, the targeting of buildings from particular angles to prevent fallout and collateral damage, the use of warnings, which institutes the precaution principle of IHL. Warnings, in fact, that this same report criticizes. You see, Israel is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. On the one hand, it is accused of indiscriminately killing civilians. But on the other, when Israel seeks to evacuate those civilians, the allegation is that of forced displacement. It is ludicrous, ladies and gentlemen. But that is on the basis of the false representations about law more broadly. Let's deal with this blood libel of genocide, which comes off the back of the previous inversions of international legal terminology: occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid. That was also subject to an entirely false report by Amnesty International. This concept of genocide is the most heinous of false allegations against the Jewish people. And undoubtedly, we have seen the consequences that these blood libels lead to. The execution of 2 Israeli staff members in DC. I do not say lightly that these organizations have blood on their hands promoting these falsehoods against the Jewish state. But why is the falsehood of genocide so heinous? Because this term was coined by Raphael Lemkin to provide legal terminology to the Jewish experience. The experience from the Holocaust of being targeted for extermination because they were Jews. That was unique in that period of time. Subsequently, of course, we have seen it again. The acts on the 7th of October, acts of genocide committed by Hamas with the intention of killing Jews. And that is the key element that Amnesty and others brush over when they seek to rewrite the law on the internationally defined crime of genocide. Because intention is critical to it. Intention to eradicate a group in whole or in part. That is the specific intent that is brushed over. This is a racial, ethnic, religious, or national group. And that intention, they argue now, can be otherwise implied. Doesn't need to be a specific intent where it is the only reasonable inference. That's the case law on the subject that was universally accepted until Amnesty tried to rewrite the law with this report. Why is it so important that this crime of crimes be focused so specifically on the intention to eradicate a group? Because it is so serious, because it is recognized as so heinous to seek to exterminate a people because of who they are. All of the evidence in this case, and the fact that we're even having this conversation is truly diabolical to me, but here we are. All of the evidence in this case points in totally the opposite direction. The aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip, despite what you just heard, 25,200 aid trucks carrying 447,538 tons of aid were facilitated into the Gaza Strip during the hostage release deal. That meant that there should have been 5 to 6 months of aid since the end of the ceasefire. You heard evidence put before you that people in Gaza were hungry. Where has that aid gone, ladies and gentlemen? Why are Amnesty International and other organizations not asking these important questions? Because if Hamas has been diverting this and preventing it from getting to the Palestinian civilians of Gaza, this is where their work should be done. Instead, in advancing this heinous blood libel of genocide against the Jewish people, they ignore the measures that Israel has taken to prevent civilian casualties. They ignore the aid that has been facilitated in, and instead they keep to their tried and tested method of seeking to delegitimize Israel at every opportunity and spread this false information. And yes, it has now become common parlance. It has, in the words of my counterpart on South African television just after the first Provisional Measures Order, now it has finally become acceptable to use Israel and genocide in the same sentence. That is not a reflection of reality, that is not a reflection of the facts, that is a reflection of the heinous blood libels and how they have been filtered through the international legal order by organizations pursuing this agenda against Israel. And I'm glad for the opportunity this evening of finally being able to put to bed this obscene allegation and the serious misinformation.
first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this important discussion. And I also want to thank the organizers for clearly underlining the need for a respectful, open-minded and balanced dialogue. That is, unfortunately, far too rare when we talk about Israel and Palestine, which is understandable given how emotionally charged this conflict is. But that makes it all the more important to keep a cool head and engage in good faith across political divides. I'll be speaking today from a political, moral and legal perspective. I'm obviously not a professor of international law, but I've studied the subject closely and I care deeply about it. Let me also say clearly, I fundamentally sympathize with Israel. Not because of any ethnic or familial ties, but because I'm a Christian and feel a personal connection to the land, because I believe that Jewish people have a right to a state where they can live in safety and peace, and because Israel, despite of its flaws, is the only functioning liberal democracy in the region. And frankly, I believe most people in the Middle East would live better lives on a political system like Israel's. That doesn't mean that Israeli lives are more worth than Palestinian ones, but their way of life is worth defending. And now let me be very clear. What happened on October the 7th in 2023 was an atrocity. A terrorist massacre of innocent civilians. Rape, mutilation, kidnappings, acts that should horrify any decent human being. And nothing, absolutely nothing, can justify that. I completely reject the idea that this was a resistance operation. It was barbarism and it has to be condemned. So yes, I believe Israel's military response, including its aim to dismantle Hamas, is legitimate. All the hostages are still not returned. As long as Hamas remains in power, Israel cannot live in peace. And although no recent election has been held, opinion polls over the years have shown significant support for Hamas in parts of the Palestinian territories. That is why the separation between the Palestinian people and Hamas isn't always as clear-cut as some would like to suggest. Hamas hides behind civilians in tunnels, schools, hospitals, because they know that Israel operates by a different standard. They know Israel tries to follow international law, and they exploit that. At the same time, the civilian casualties in Gaza are shocking. Estimates range from 30,000 to over 50,000. And even if some were Hamas fighters, and undoubtedly there will be, that is still a devastating number of innocent lives lost. Morally, we must hold two truths at once. One, Israel has a right to defend its citizens, and two, and every effort must be made to protect innocent Palestinians. Children, women, and men with no ties to Hamas, they deserve to live. But now the central question, is this a genocide? The term is used widely and was also used just before, and it's used widely in the international debate as well as in Denmark. But genocide is a very specific legal concept. Under the Genocide Convention, two elements must be met. First, the actus reus, the objective acts, including killings or creating conditions that threaten a group's survival. And that threshold may arguably have been met given the level of destruction and reports of Block 8. But the second element is even more important, the so-called dolus specialis, the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group as such. And that is incredibly hard to prove. As the ICJ ruled in Bosnia versus Serbia, even systematic atrocities are not enough without clear evidence of that intent. And in this case, I find it very unlikely that such intent can be demonstrated. Yes, there are some statements from Israeli officials that have been deeply problematic. But proving a state policy aimed at destroying the Palestinian people, that bar is incredibly high, and rightly so. Without that, we dilute the meaning of genocide. More likely, what we're looking at may potentially be war crimes or crimes against humanity, depending on proportionality, distinction, and military necessity. And that is for the courts to decide. So, to conclude, I don't believe what we are seeing qualifies as a genocide. And I think it is unhelpful and even dangerous to throw the word around. Israel's war against Hamas is legitimate, but it must be fought within the boundaries of international law, and that I am totally in agreement. The goal should not be to maximize punishment, but to maximize justice. And I think the international community should pressure Hamas to release the hostages, something that is not mentioned often in this debate, but also pressure Israel to minimize civilian suffering. Because if we abandon law and morality entirely, we all lose. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, all of you. First of all, we'll take a little round here with reactions from the panel and then questions from you. First of all, let me just ask you, and maybe I'll ask you first. Obviously, you could look at what is happening in Gaza and be horrified, and be against it, and be very critical and confront it in any way you want. Why is it important for Amnesty International to go into the debate about genocide? Why does it matter?
Is it on? No?
Take this one.
So we believe in Amnesty that it is important to document all kinds of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. And we don't have a hierarchy of violations, so we document war crimes, we document crimes against humanity, we document genocide where that happens, and we document in many different conflict zones all over the world. We believe it's important for us to look closely at what's happening in Gaza because it's out of proportion. And I want to say as well, now that I heard a lot of criticism from Natasha, to our work, that, and it shouldn't be, I think it's problematic that I have to state this, but of course what Hamas and other armed groups did the 7th of October 2023 was war crimes. Of course it was. You are not allowed under international humanitarian law to take hostages. You're not allowed to directly attack civilians, and we have said this many times in Amnesty International. And we are investigating what happened the 7th of October as well. So, put that aside, we are focusing especially on Gaza with the resource that we have because it is out of proportion compared to what happened the 7th of October.
But why is it important to establish, it's a legal term, genocide.
It is a legal term,
why is it important for Amnesty International to establish even before even before the court has judged so that this is actually in fact genocide?
Because the Genocide Convention was made to prevent also genocide from taking place. So we are obligated to act if we think there's a risk of this taking place. And we have documented war crimes taking place in Gaza, we have documented crimes against humanity, and now with the specific focus on intent, as I mentioned, we have collected over 100 statements that is dehumanizing the Palestinian population in Gaza, and we believe also saying that, describing it as deliberate destruction of the group as a whole. And we have an obligation as a civil society organization to use our resources to collect all this information that is available and to reach these legal analysis and make societies or make states prevent this from happening.
Okay, so let's talk about a few of the issues that were mentioned in the opening statements. First of all, the question of intent. All of you have been talking about this. The question of intent, linking statements from different Israeli politicians, officials, to what is actually happening in Gaza. Natasha, what do you think, if you look at it from a legal point of view, is the problem of the arguments that, for instance, Amnesty International gives us about intent?
So the problem with the reliance on the statements, and this is also applicable to South Africa's submissions, is that significantly they misrepresent what is being said. These are statements from senior members, including of the government, that have been talking about Hamas and the importance of destroying Hamas. And to a point, they are misrepresented as though these individuals are talking about destroying the Palestinian people. Even if that were not the case, look at the actions which clearly demonstrate the complete opposite of what is being alleged. But this is all deeply concerning. There's something that's just been said, which I do feel I need to pick up on, and that is that what Israel is doing is out of all proportion to what happened on the 7th of October. That is so telling, ladies and gentlemen. That is not how international law works, and any organisation or person purporting to speak about international law should go back to the books and educate themselves. Proportionality in international law is clearly set out in the rules that govern armed conflict, and it requires strikes to be proportionate when you take into account the anticipated military advantage against the anticipated collateral damage. That is a very gruesome analysis, balancing that has to be conducted, but that is what the laws of armed conflict require. This grotesque, out of proportion to what happened on the 7th of October position that seeks to compare casualty figures on both sides, not only encourages Hamas with their use of human shields, but grossly misrepresents international law and suggests that Israel simply shouldn't be permitted to defend itself. Because there is no way that you can deal with Hamas by causing fewer casualty figures, and I just want to pick up, I'm hesitant to disagree with people on my side of the debate, but I do need to call out this reliance on Hamas casualty figures. The international media has been parroting these figures, as it parrots all of the news coming out of Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas. But these figures have been debunked. They have been based upon Hamas officials sending out Google documents to the population saying, insert your martyrs here. They've been demonstrated to have been fabricated. And that's just the total figures. Before we get on to the women and children who are alleged to have been killed, and also the pregnant children included in that. But the fact that these figures make no distinction between combatants and civilians, or simply do not tell you how these people are said to have died, well, we know Hamas are shooting their own civilians.
Okay.
We also know that civilians are killed because Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets fall short in Gaza, killing them indiscriminately because they don't fall subject to a proportionality analysis. So on every single level, it's just baffling and deeply concerning.
Okay, let's try to take one thing at a time. The question, we're talking about intent, and we're also talking about the methodology in relying on Hamas. How do you make sure, or how do you build the bridge between some, as you also mentioned, some statements by Israeli politicians and officials saying that Hamas needs to be destroyed, or even something about some kind of collective responsibility, which has also been said by some Israeli politicians, to establishing that there is, to the intent of the state and with the military. I mean, there is quite a leap there, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing that I haven't said before as well, that our conclusion in the report states that it is not there can be two objectives in Gaza for the Israeli military. It can be to defeat Hamas, which is a legal target. It's a military target, and we know that that's legally that you can go after that legally under international humanitarian law, but there can be another objective that can coexist, aligned with defeating Hamas, and we see that as being a genocide of the Palestinian population. And the statements that we have looked into uses the Palestinian as a whole and describes them as being human animals or human beasts. We have a statement saying that Hamas can be everyone. It can be those who sing, those who support, and those who distribute sweets.
Yes, but let me just ask you again, how do you make the connection between these individual statements to the intent? Because we're talking about the intent of a state. I mean, this is the legal,
yes,
the legal challenge.
yes.
How would you conclude that this or that or the third statement is actually the amount to the intent of Israel in this war?
If we have these intents being set by people in power in the Israeli government and also in the Israeli military, and we see that it is trickling down to people on the ground in Gaza in their military, celebrating the bombings of civilian houses, as we have seen videos from IDF doing so, backing up by continued statements saying that this is not just Hamas, but it's all Palestinians in Gaza that is seen as these beasts and animals. We see that as
yes, and there have been statements even from ministers in the government saying quite disturbing things about collective responsibility in Gaza.
Well, the statements from those who have an input to policy have consistently been about Hamas. There are all sorts of people who, especially after the 7th of October, said all sorts of things. But as you correctly point out, I think that is not a reflection of Israeli policy. But may I just pick up on this? This is not what international law says about intent. This idea that there can be coexisting intents. In the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which I believe Christian was speaking to earlier, it's clear that the genocidal intent must be the only reasonable inference. So what Amnesty have said in their report, talking about dual or instrumental intent, they've actually invented this term. It doesn't exist. But now artificial intelligence will tell you that it's applicable to genocide because of the Amnesty report. This is how international law gets rewritten, ladies and gentlemen. This is completely made up. It goes against all of the ICJ, ICTY, ICTR, ICC case law. Only reasonable inference is the standard. And on that, open your eyes. Look at the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The one thing I would say is that it is the international community that bears responsibility here for continued Palestinian suffering. Because there is a very simple solution to this, which is what I have been calling for since October 2023. And that is that a Palestinian humanitarian zone be set up the other side of the border in Egypt, in Egyptian Rafah, where there is more space than you know what to do with, where these Palestinian civilians could be provided for, international aid to your heart's content, which critically is not diverted to Hamas, and where Hamas are not able to abuse the humanitarian zones that Israel has set up in the Gaza Strip to continue to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians.
Okay.
That, ladies and gentlemen, would be the easy response. But I haven't heard Amnesty calling for that.
Yeah.
Let's just please just answer this criticism.
Yes. Because we are following International Court of Justice interpretation. According to ICJ's case law, it establishes that the only reasonable inference from the pattern of conduct evidence must be that the intent to destroy a group is one of the state's intentions. But the court has never held that the intent to destroy a group must be the state's only intention in a military campaign. That misinterpretation of the court's jurisprudence is incompatible with the prohibition of genocide in times of war, which is enshrined in Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. And such a misinterpretation would make finding genocide and armed conflict effectively impossible, as armed conflict necessarily involves the pursuit of a military goal. And that's why we are seeing that there are these two coexisting objectives.
Right.
So I think I can see what's happening here. The ICTY made it clear that inferring specific intent on the basis of facts and circumstances must be based on the only reasonable inference based on the evidence. This insertion of dual or instrumental intent is a rewriting of international law, but it simply does not stand up against the facts. This is this unholy alliance of the misrepresentations of the law and the facts together, which is what is being used to get over the threshold of this crime of genocide. But I'm afraid that the consistent emphasis of all of the case law has been that where there are other possible explanations, and so where there are multiple analyses as to the intention, the only reasonable inference is the key test. And here we don't even get to that, because there is this enormous leap that is being sought to be made on the basis of the misinterpretation and misrepresentation of the statements alongside the misrepresentation of the actions. And it's the only way that this allegation can be put forward. So much so that Ireland has now also sought to intervene in the South Africa case to tweak the definition of genocide, because all of these people accept that on its face the definition of genocide could never apply to the armed conflict in Gaza.
Very quick. Yeah.
Because, so that is your interpretation of international humanitarian law, Natasha, and we have come to another from a very detailed, large report that we made in Amnesty International with other legal scholars also reading it through before publicizing it. And we have many other scholars that are saying this is genocide. We have the UN saying that it seems that it could be a genocide, and they are already...
The UN has never said that. The ICJ? Okay, so there are other misrepresentations in the report as to what the ICJ has
So
said.
there's the UN Committee on Palestine that has said
Okay,
that
let's
it's genocide. So I'm wondering what kind of documentation you're basing your interpretation on.
All of the consistent case law, as I indicated, of all of the criminal tribunals, as well as the ICC and the ICJ, to the extent that the analysis of intent has been conducted, this is a new step and seeking to develop international law in a way that it has simply never been applied before. But I mean, I really hope we'll get on to the other real problems in this report and the consistent misinformation, and there are additional examples.
I want to ask you about that now. The question of, one thing is the intent, the other thing is the consequences on the ground, civilian casualties, and also you were talking about, Natasha, about the methodology of the report. Trine, when you talk about proportionality and the amount of casualties in Gaza, civilian casualties, you are mainly basing the numbers on reports from statements from the health authorities of Gaza, which are, of course, controlled by Hamas. The criticism, as you well know, in that direction would be that you cannot trust that. You don't know how many of these are civilians, you don't know how many of these are Hamas militants, and so on. So what do you think of the problem of reporting the numbers?
I think it is a problem. And it's also a problem that Israel doesn't allow international observers and journalists to come in to Gaza and help us understand what is happening. So that's part of the problem. I think with regards to the numbers, there has been an international agreement that you can actually more or less count on the numbers that do come out. The UN uses the numbers as well. It's not just something that I...
When you say international agreement, what do you mean?
There has been, I don't recall which British newspaper it was, but there was a British newspaper saying that there has been international organizations looking at this, looking at how does armed conflict normally involve that type of warfare, what are the casualties that would normally come out in terms of numbers, and they have been estimating that the numbers seems to be fairly accurate.
Yeah.
So okay. I think that's what we have, right?
Yes, and Amnesty International, you are in part using these numbers coming from the health authorities of Gaza, that is Hamas. Why is that not a problem?
Because the thing is that is the numbers that we have, and UN organizations, OCHA, other organs are using these numbers as well and saying that they are credible, and saying there are probably lots more people that have died that are still buried under rubble and buildings. But the key question is exactly why are we not letting any independent journalists, independent investigators, more people into Gaza so that we can get an idea of what is going on. We need to see this from different actors, and right now Israel is blocking the opportunity also for us in Amnesty International to get an office there and to get investigators on the ground.
So Christian, there are enough international institutions actually believing the numbers getting out of Gaza, so we should believe them. What do you think of that?
Well, it sounds like we don't need the ICJ when we have Amnesty International. And I just have to say, there is, of course, also an information war going on, and people should be aware of this also when you're representing an interest organization. And I also find it hard to figure out what exact numbers are the correct, but I will say this, I have more trust in the numbers from Israel than from Gaza, from Hamas. I have zero trust in a terrorist organization. And I will say that I find it extremely problematic that an organization like Amnesty International, which historically has been very critical of Israel, uses a term like genocide when there is nothing that suggests that that would be the verdict in a court. And I don't know as much about this as Natasha, so I'll just lean on her expertise, but that is definitely also what I could what I, in my studies, have figured, that there is a very high burden of proof when it's about a genocide, and it just seems like this is another accusation in the long history of accusations from Amnesty International towards Israel. Actually, I participated in a debate which Trine was one of the organizers of 2 years ago, before the 7th of October in 2023. Unfortunately, I didn't get to say very much because there were some people in the audience who didn't like me, who didn't like when I said that Israel is the only democracy in the region, and it made a lot of noise, so I couldn't get to my points. But there was a question around afterwards, and there was also a representative from Amnesty International who questioned me about Israel not treating some of their prisoners' rights. And I just asked her whether they had looked into the conditions in Gaza, and she couldn't say anything about that, because no, they are not looking into the conditions there. And that's just, to me, proves that there is a bias. There's a bias in Amnesty International. There is also a bias in UN, because they are condemning Israel 1,000 times more than a lot of other dictatorships around the world. The former UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon has admitted that there is a clear Israel anti-bias.
All right, good. Try to keep your statements quiet and your answers quite short, so we'll have time for questions in a second. Trine, please.
This is a very short comment then. I think it's extraordinary how this turns into become a tribunal on amnesty, and I think that's not the concept. It was an open dialogue, right?
But they're the ones accusing of genocide, and I think that's pretty central.
You can speak after me, yeah, if you want, if Martin allows you. No, I just want to say, Natasha, I think you would make a very good politician, because you're actually using international law and weaponizing it against the critical voices against Israel. And I have to say, you do a very good case, but I don't think your arguments are based on law, they're political arguments. And that's fully fair, but don't cover it up in your interpretation of international law, while you have the whole international society more or less agreeing that Israel is in breach of international law, in breach of international humanitarian law.
Which law? Name one.
Geneva Conventions.
Geneva Conventions.
Which part?
Okay, but that's the whole point, being that you are using your position to do politics, and that's fully legal, but don't cover it up in legal arguments. Just stand by that you want to defend Israel. And I think it's quite extraordinary, as well as my last very short comment, that every time there is a discussion on the way Israel is waging its war, the counter-argument goes, but look at Hamas. And we have to look at Hamas, obviously. But there is no disagreement, I guess, in this room that we condemn that terror attack, right? So that's not where the disagreement is. It's not the discussion on how Israel is carrying out this war. That's the discussion, that's why we discuss it.
Okay.
That cannot be covered up or forgotten because
so there are a few things here. Now, actually, the allegation goes both ways, that you are both actually covering political
I haven't
bias
said
or by...
Yeah, I haven't said look at Hamas once.
Excuse me?
I haven't said look at Hamas once. I'm perfectly happy to discuss Israel's conduct and how it complies, not just complies, but goes over and above the requirements of international law. Because let me be clear, IHL and the key principles, necessity, proportionality, distinction, and precaution, they are quite basic. What Israel does consistently goes well above the requirements of international law in terms of preventing civilian casualties in Gaza. This is why this allegation is quite so heinous. Now, I haven't said look at Hamas once, apart from their own conduct in seeking to generate as many Palestinian casualties as possible. But the reason that they are an important party to watch here is because they read these reports. They listen to what Amnesty and others say on international media and how it feeds into political statements. So we have the recent one from the UK, France and Canada as a case in point. And they take encouragement from that. This perpetuates the conflict. This costs Palestinian lives. Now, I appreciate the focus has been on Amnesty. May I just spread a little of the love by talking about Oxfam Denmark, a tweet from the 23rd of December 2024. I'm afraid I had to translate a lot of these from Danish, but here we go. Case in point. Israel has only allowed 12 trucks of aid to reach northern Gaza in 2.5 months. Hunger is being used as a weapon of war, and Israel's blocking of aid is part of ethnic cleansing. Families are starving, children are searching through garbage for food. Ceasefire now. Right, that was an allegation. Israel had only allowed 12 trucks of aid to reach Gaza in 2.5 months. October 2024, 463 trucks. November 2024, 915 trucks. December 2023, so we're working backwards, right? 888 trucks. This misinformation is replete in the report, but Amnesty has put out as well. A similar allegation, crucially, quoting from the report, during no month between October 2023 and June 2024, using either UNRWA or COGAT data, did the reported number of trucks carrying imports into Gaza come even close to reaching the daily average of 327 trucks. This is what the report says. It purports to have used COGAT data. Now, COGAT is the unit of the Israeli Defense Forces that is responsible for humanitarian provision in armed conflict. Right? They have a website set up. You can go and look this up and check, because it's all available there, as to the amount of aid that has gone in. Gaza-aid-data.gov.il. Right? This report clearly didn't take that into account because it's incorrect. 263 trucks entered on the 19th of May 2024, 324 trucks entered on the 20th of May 2024, 298 trucks entered. I'm going to take up too much of your time, but you get the picture.
You got the picture, and so and your argument here is that Israel is not using famine as a weapon.
Well, my argument, where we're being told that this is all because Israel doesn't allow international journalists and aid organizations into Gaza. You have the information on the internet. You're still misrepresenting it, so please don't take us for fools.
So I understand that you're very, very critical of Amnesty International, but as Amnesty and Oxfam and probably a lot of other organizations as well. Well, my question is, we are not the only one in Amnesty International documenting this. And if we put aside our genocide report, lots of other international humanitarian organizations, we have UN organs, we have legal experts that are saying the same things, and we see pictures and videos of children that are being bombed, we see people starving. You're probably witnessing that on your social media, a lot of you that are sitting here.
But the argument here would be that is probably true, that there is starving, that there are civilian deaths, that a lot of children have died. The question is really proportionality. I mean, at what point are the consequences of the war too high? Is there a legal way to decide that, or is it actually, as it sounds, because also this discussion turns out to be a political discussion, and maybe it should be understood as a political discussion. Is it a political judgment to decide whether the proportions are too high?
No, it's not a political judgment.
Then how do you decide?
Collecting documentation from the ground, which is very, very difficult, as I said before. we cannot enter Gaza, so we need locals to help us go to the field and go to the specific attacks that have happened. We need reports from Doctors Without Borders that are present. Some of them still are. We have some UN bodies that are still present, Red Cross, and they are also saying the same things. They're saying that they need food, that people are dying from hunger now, that they don't have fuel, they don't have all of these equipment. And I mean, from what I hear from you, Natasha, you're saying that all of that is wrong? That is misinformation.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. We've heard pictures of starving children being referenced. I've seen them reported in the press, even yesterday by Sky News. I've also seen the remarkably well-fed mothers next to them. I have never encountered a mother who would eat before her starving child. The fact that very ill children who cannot consume or take in nutrients, which has been the case in several of these propaganda photos. The last one, the Sky News report, it was clear, if you read the small print, that this was a child who was so ill it could not accept its mother's breast milk or formula, right? The fact that these are being used, are being presented to you in the media and on social media as evidence of starvation is diabolical, because these are sick children that are being abused. If there is an allegation of starvation in Gaza, and I appreciate that you are trying to facilitate both sides by accepting it, I fundamentally reject it without evidence, where the evidence demonstrates the opposite, that more than enough food has gone into Gaza. The analysis of this, I gave you some numbers, right? It doesn't mean much. I appreciate trucks, volume, tonnage. The analysis between January and July last year that was conducted by academics, including nutritionists, that looked at the nutritional value of the amount of food that had gone in, that is instructive, because over 3,000 calories per day per person went in over the course of that period. Now, that is well in excess of the NHS guidelines on recommended calorific intake. I'm assuming you have something similar here in Denmark. Where has this food gone? This is what was facilitated into the Gaza Strip by Israel. Over the ceasefire period, aid flooded in, so that the stopping of aid, in order to pressure Hamas, since that ceasefire fell apart, was a calculated obligation that was more than enough food.
Would you agree, at least, that within the last, in the last 2 months, until a few days ago, Israel withheld aid to get into Gaza?
This is what I was just saying. This is correct, because there was 5 to 6 months worth of aid stockpiled in Gaza. Where has it gone? Now, when I visited Gaza in September last year, I saw the enormous football field sizes of storage facilities at the border, inside Gaza, after inspection by Israel, of food that was there, rotting in some cases.
Okay. All right, just a very brief answer from you. What is, I mean, would you accept that there is a challenge in creating a sound picture of what is happening, for instance, with aid in Gaza? I mean, the argument here is it's actually coming and then it's disappearing because Hamas is getting it, stealing it, blocking it, or whatever. This is the argument of Israel. What do you make of this when you look at Israel's actions?
From what I hear from other NGOs, and I just participated in a briefing as well with the heads of Red Cross and Danish Aid and other UNICEF as well, they are saying that there is no food there. It's empty, and they're saying we don't have evidence that it's Hamas that is deliberately stealing this. Of course, at the moment, people are desperate in Gaza. Everyone is looking for food. Everyone is looking for how to survive just one more day. So, of course, people will be eager and desperate to get the food that will come in, but it's not an organized crime by Hamas to steal it. That's not what the big NGOs are telling us. And you were just referring to numbers from Israel. I mean, we need to broaden our perspective and also hear about other organizations that are in Gaza, not just relying on information that comes from Israel. Hamas.
Do you think that the numbers and the claims coming from Israel are trustworthy?
Yes, for this reason. I worked in Israel at the Supreme Court. In 2016, I clerked for the former president, the late Miriam Naor.
And I know that Israel is a country of law and order. I know that institutions are held accountable. That's one of the reasons that there will be a delay in getting comment from official spokespeople, from the spokesperson's unit of the IDF, when incidents happen that are reported on the media. So, the truth takes even longer to get its pants on in Israel because it has to be absolutely accurate before they put it out. The notion that this information can be cast aside, as it clearly has been in this report and others, and Hamas can be relied on as a substitute, is mind-boggling, but it is indicative of what has happened not just to international organizations, but also to the media across this period. So I have spent a significant degree of time over the last year with Douglas Murray, who I've known for a very long time. He went on an embed with the IDF in Lebanon. Unlike in Gaza, where the circumstances of that armed conflict, and when I was there in September, I saw that Hamas had booby-trapped every second house in Rafah that we were in, and was using mosques, schools, and hospitals to conduct its terror operations from. So whereas journalists cannot be allowed into Gaza in those circumstances, there was the possibility for them to embed with IDF forces in Lebanon. And do you know what those journalists said? We have to be very careful, of course, what we report because of our colleagues in Beirut. And what Hezbollah, another Iranian terror proxy, would do to their colleagues if they reported the wrong thing. Where is the journalistic integrity, ladies and gentlemen? And where is the integrity of these organizations that Amnesty and others are relying upon that have consistently put out false information? Only yesterday, there was a report that UNICEF was being used to channel funds from the British government into Hamas hands in cash. It's starting to become clear how Hamas have paid for this extraordinary terror army that they have built over so much time. The fact that these organizations operating in Gaza are not able to put information out that does not have the blessing of Hamas shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us. But those that repeat it, who have this context and this knowledge, they are severely responsible.
Okay. Trine, briefly? Yeah.
I find it mind-blowing that you say that Amnesty's numbers are wrong. Oxfam, UNICEF, UNRWA, UNDP, all these numbers are wrong. But you actually do not come up with others. You just refer to the Israeli website.
I think I just explained exactly why those numbers are wrong and cannot be trusted, because they have been shown time and time and again, including the fact that IPC reports, right, that previously predicted famine in Gaza were based on that incorrect information. They've been discredited. They've been shown to have been based only on impartial information and to have reached implausible conclusions again and again and again, even by UN bodies like the Famine Review Committee. So, I mean, only a crazy person would use the same wrong numbers again and again and again and expect a different outcome and expect them to be accurate. So
you're part of a group called the UK Lawyers for Israel, right?
We do what we say on the tin.
And you make your own reports. I do not know on what numbers you based your reports, though. But you made different reports. And one of your colleagues said that the main health problem in Gaza before the terror attack was obesity.
That's completely wrong. I'm sorry. That's another major misrepresentation. No,
okay.
That's another major misrepresentation.
Okay, but then...
It's just to say, I think it's fully fair, but it's a political point of view. It's not a legal or an informative point of view.
Okay, it's an interesting discussion. It is. It's very important. We have to include you up here. So, is this the only mic here? And who is going to? I'm not running around with it. So who is?
I do not.
Okay. And please, people, brief as possible. If you want just to do a statement, another question, please do, but do it very brief so we can continue to another question. Let's start up here, yes? And up here, see? Up here, yeah. And give us your name before, and then the question. Well done. Yes, that was a bit of a detour, but all right. Okay.
Hello. Yes. Okay. I'll try to be brief because I'm more interested in the reply than in my own questions.
I want to get the names right. Annette, you're from Amnesty International. More than once I heard you say today that your reports align with other organizations, and quote, Doctors Without Borders and Red Cross. I want to lean back. You mentioned those two organizations. And I want to go back to something that Christian said, that there is a bias that can be proved about those organizations. But by the very simple example that even though those organizations, specifically the Red Cross, is in Gaza, they haven't visited the hostages once. How can we trust someone who is so close to the real, most direct victims of the conflict right now? They haven't been visited once, not by claims of them, and not by Hamas. No one has allowed them. That Amnesty International holds a very big responsibility on putting numbers that are beyond question, and putting claims that are beyond question. And the accusation...
So the question...
The question is exactly that. How can you base numbers and methodology on organizations that can be proved that have a bias against Israel, and bear the responsibility of Amnesty International to back these claims, but following those questions?
Okay, we in a sense... In a sense, we already covered this, but just briefly, we are talking about organizations which Israel and other critics would say have a bias against Israel, like UNRWA, for instance. What do you say?
Red Cross do not have a bias, what I know, against Israel, and we do not have a bias in Amnesty against Israel. So it's not correct. And the things that we do...
Just please don't laugh when people are saying anything. Just don't do that again, okay? All right? That's really, really stupid. Okay? Just get out. All right. Just maybe you should explain why Amnesty International doesn't have a bias against Israel.
I think I've said that already from the beginning, what our mandate is, and our mandate is to cover violations of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. And that is what we are doing, and we are looking into the attacks that happened the 7th of October. I already said that. And also what is happening now in Gaza against civilians. So our aim is to protect civilians, and that's it. And that is what we're doing, and we are relying on information that we get from trusted NGOs like Red Cross, like UNICEF, like OCHA, like IPC, like Doctors Without Borders. And we would, if we could, we would like to have an office ourselves in Gaza, where we have been kicked out of Israel. So we're relying on local field workers.
Okay. Thanks. And Christian?
Yeah, I would just like to comment real quick, because I actually agree with Trine. This shouldn't be like a football match where you are rooting for one team. And I can't sit here and rule out that there might have been committed war crimes in this conflict. And I just think it should be up to the ICJ and not Amnesty International to decide. And I will say this, it's just very, very, very unlikely that there is a genocide. I think the only part that has had genocidal intent in this conflict is Hamas. And that is very clear, because they have a stated purpose of trying to destroy Israel or accuse.
Do you think Hamas has genocidal intent? We're talking about genocidal intent when it comes to Israel. Do you think Hamas does?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on that. What I can say is that based on what I know, they made a terrible, outrageous terror attack on Israel that we can only do one thing about: condemn, and we can ask for the responsible people to be persecuted and punished.
Okay.
Like everyone else.
Okay. So you don't know. So what do you think, Natasha? And we need more mics for the next time.
Forgive me, but there are some responses that are laughable, and this is one of them. Hamas is clear about its genocidal intent. Yahya Sinwar was clear when he called before the 7th of October to tear down the border and tear out the hearts and the livers of the Jews. Right? Genocidal intent against the Jews, remember. Ethnic, racial, religious or national group. The fact that anyone would have anything less than a degree of 100% clarity, given the repeated statements by Hamas, given their charter, and given their clear statements to commit those genocidal acts over and over again, is utterly baffling.
Right. Will you answer? Yeah?
No, I just noticed that Natasha just basically wants to laugh at my answer, so it's a very good conversation.
Actually, there was an argument that the leader of Hamas said something very clear about destroying Israel as they're tearing out their
and also Hamas, it's a terror organization.
No, I'm just asking you if you think that Hamas has genocidal intent behind the terror attack.
They certainly committed a whole lot of war crimes, and probably also crimes against humanity. That's why there is an arrest warrant also at the ICC for one of the leaders that also passed. Died, killed, yes. Like the two others.
Yeah.
That was also on the list. You want to take that?
Please, I want to take it, yes. Thank you.
It's just, I think this point is very central, because this proves a bias. You're reluctant to say whether Hamas has a genocidal intent, but you're very quick in judging Israel as having a genocidal intent, even though that is very
What would you say if you were asked if Hamas had genocidal intent behind the attack in October 7?
In Amnesty International, we haven't done research into the question of genocide from Hamas's.
But why not?
We haven't. We are right now looking into the war crimes that took place and crimes against humanity against the Israeli populations.
Okay, just to let you, I mean, nobody really gets more clever or enlightened by sounds and laughter and so on. I have a question here and then up here afterwards. Name, please, and question.
My name is Nina Bond. First of all, Natasha, from one lawyer to another, thank you for your patience. We've just heard today from you, Trine, that you base your politics and your statement as a politician on what comes from Amnesty. So I'm putting you aside, and unfortunately again, a question for Amnesty. When, or let's say, if ICJ conclude that there's a genocide, is there not a risk that Amnesty, by being so bombastic in your conclusive and report, that you've undermined the concept and the protection of that term because of your premature conclusions? And how do you think people will react out on the streets with activism and calls of weaponized resistance if and when ICJ comes to the conclusion that there's no genocide? Because they will point at you and say, you told us there was a genocide. Are you not at risk at harming this?
All right. Okay.
As I also said earlier, we're looking at all violations against all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, and we don't have a hierarchy. So we look into war crimes, we look into crimes against humanity, into genocide, if that's what we can find documentation and see that is going on. And we believe that genocide and the convention was made with the purpose of preventing such an act from being committed again. And we believe that we have the responsibility to put out all the documentation that we have available, to analyze it, to use our legal experts, our teams of military experts and tech experts, to then look into if this is genocide or not. And we also respect the ICJ, and of course they should have time to come with their verdict and do their own
but the question
as well.
was whether you were too fast in establishing this as a fact.
No, I don't think
If the court will come to the conclusion that it's not genocide, that you were
well,
wrong.
then we will have to look at that. I mean, I don't know what will happen at the ICJ, but I believe that we in Amnesty have found so much evidence and so much documentation that we can put out this report. I don't know if you read it, but it is very comprehensive.
Several times.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we believe that it
All right.
documents it.
Okay. Up there, that's a question, please.
All right, my name is Tobias, and I'll keep this rather brief because it's mostly just a question of elaboration. We've talked a lot about biases, both in relation to Hamas, but also in relation to non-governmental agencies and organizations backed by the UN who were put in place to stop the atrocities of the 20th century from ever repeating itself. And just before, maybe a couple of minutes ago, we kind of glossed over the part where we talked about the fact that we're not allowing any third-party observers in Gaza. Like, to my knowledge, there are two biased parts in any conflict. That counts for Hamas as well as Israel. Why do Israel not allow any third-party observers? Just a question, I don't know.
We don't really have any officials from Israel, but you want to?
I can tell you.
Yeah.
I can tell you what I've been told when I've asked that a question of officials, and it's because of the military situation in the Gaza Strip, and frankly, the limited ability that I had to visit with a military expert panel was limited. What journalists have consistently demanded is the ability to wander freely, to speak to people. That is not possible in the context of the armed conflict that Israel has been forced to encounter in the Gaza Strip. But there is a very important point here. May I just come back to it briefly? And it's relevant because the ICJ was just referenced again. And it comes back to this debate about whether international law is being rewritten. And I thought I had seen this in the report, but I didn't want to say anything before locating the quote. It's baffling to me, the argument that was being put forward, because the report at paragraph 5.5.2 on intent is perfectly clear that Amnesty is rewriting the definition of genocide, or at least seeking to develop international law significantly, where it says, however, it's referring to the International Court of Justice, rulings on inferring intent can be read extremely narrowly, in a manner that would potentially preclude a state from having genocidal intent alongside one or more additional motives or goals in relation to the conduct of its military operations. As outlined below, Amnesty International considers that this is an overly cramped interpretation of international jurisprudence, and one that would effectively preclude a finding of genocide in the context of an armed conflict. This is what they say in their own report, so to have it contradicted by a representative today, and to be told, no, we're not seeking to rewrite international law here, just apply it, really does stretch the bounds of credibility.
What was the answer to the question?
Why is
security issues? Just imagine for a moment, right? These journalists, these international organizations that essentially go and they're not able to report freely. We know that because Hamas controls everything that comes out of the Gaza Strip. Imagine the battlefield that Israel is encountering with Hamas pretending to be civilians, fighting house to house. This is their tactic that they deploy.
Natasha, wouldn't you agree that also Israel is biased in this conflict when it comes to information?
In terms of the information that it puts out, biased in what sense? The numbers? No, the numbers...
That it has an interest in keeping numbers lower than they might be, or higher.
The difficulty I have with that suggestion is if Israel ever puts out any information that is not 120% verifiable, it will not live to see another day of credibility. I appreciate the people sitting on my left don't consider Israel credible anyway, but the fact is the information that they've put out checks out again and again because the accountability that exists in Israel amongst these institutions, which is what happens in a democracy. Any comparison between that and an internationally prescribed terrorist organization that has a track record of fabricating, lying, and influencing the international media according to its propaganda agenda is truly disgraceful.
Okay, thanks. Up here, and we have 10 more minutes, and we'll try to have as many questions as possible. Please go ahead, keep it brief. And then the question is your sentence with a question mark at the end.
Yes, thank you very much. This is mostly a question to Christian Holst Vigilius. And this is, in your presentation already, you said rather in one sentence that the court, that is the ICJ, must judge. But at the same time, you said that you already deemed that it is highly unlikely there is any genocide to be judged about. I am reading very shortly a summary of the court, and from its summary, it's point 66, but it's summarized in the start. In view of the fundamental values sought to be protected by Genocide Convention, the court considers that the plausible rights in question in these proceedings namely the right of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, and the right of South Africa to seek Israel's compliance with the latter's obligation under the Convention, are of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. That is a very long sentence to say risk of genocide. How do you relate to that risk?
Okay, please.
Well, I don't think anything you said contradicts what I said, because I can't rule out what is actually happening in the Gaza Strip right now. I find it highly unlikely that there is a genocide going on. But what the ICJ has said is that it's plausible. So that's why they have put out 6 provisional measures to make sure that there won't be as many civilian deaths. That does not mean that they think there is a genocide going on. That is trying to make sure that there won't be a genocide.
Okay. Briefly.
Would the gentleman be kind enough to read the paragraph reference for plausible genocide? I can save you some time. It doesn't exist. The paragraph that you just read out has been consistently misrepresented up to the point when Joe Donoghue, who wrote that order, the former president of the International Court of Justice, came out on Hard Talk on the BBC to correct the record on this. The fact that it is continuing to be misrepresented now really takes the biscuit. Plausible rights is the provisional measures test. It asks, do the rights that South Africa is claiming on behalf of the Palestinians fall under the Genocide Convention? There was no assessment of the merits, there was no assessment of the case that Israel has put forward. The court is clear in its order. The fact that you read out that paragraph and then said, well, this is basically plausible genocide. If that is what the court found, it would have said so. This is a perfect example of even this circus of the International Court of Justice continually being misrepresented, and it has informed, undoubtedly, an awful lot of the policy decisions that have been taken against Israel on a completely misconceived basis.
All right. Okay. We can take 2 more questions. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Max. This is a question directed mostly to Natasha. So you were talking about the Hamas statements, that you can clearly see that there's genocidal intent in them. But I feel like there's a double standard, because you said, oh, you can clearly see that they're genocidal, Hamas or whatever. I'm not here to defend them. I'm just saying, you know, that there's a logical fallacy when you say you can't see it in Israel. And you said, oh, but it's not a representation of policy when you look at the statements from the government of Israel. But you say it's, oh, you can see the genocidal intent in Hamas when you look at their statements. So it's kind of like, okay, it's just picking and choosing from your side, you know? That's what it feels like. Thank you.
Okay. Yes? Briefly? Why does it count when it's Hamas and not Israel?
Because Hamas recorded on GoPros when they committed their barbarous atrocities that fulfilled those acts of genocide demonstrating the intent. When they raped and slaughtered and burned babies, when they came armed with maps and instructions about who lived in which house and family by family what they were intending to do to each of the family members, that is not any kind of distinction that one can draw. It is on the basis of evidence and clear demonstrative intent, which has even been repeated after the event. So there is no comparison there whatsoever, I'm afraid.
All right, and a question up here.
Hi, I have a question to you, Trine. What evidence would you need to change your mind? Because I've seen you, I've followed you,
Evidence of what?
Of genocide that we were talking about. Long before there was a report from Amnesty, you was very active in an anti-Israeli way. What evidence do you need of there not being a genocide?
Okay. Trine, did you make up your mind before? That's a question, isn't it? Yeah.
First of all, I didn't call it a genocide before there was a report. I said it was a lot of war crimes, and so that was my language. And I stand by that. I think it was easy to see. There's a lot of documentation was out before the Amnesty report. And second, I'm not anti-Israel. I'm not anti-Israel. I'm pro-international law. I'm pro-human rights, and I'm pro-Geneva Conventions. And I think they should apply to each and every party in a war. And I think the problem here is not that we're all able to see it and use it against Hamas and other terror organizations. I think the big problem, and it comes back to your question, Max, why is it so difficult to use the same lens when we look at what Israel is doing in Gaza? I think that's the problem, that's the key problem.
The same lens as?
The same lens as we use when we look at the way Hamas, Russia, all other parties that do breach international law.
All right. Okay. Over here, last question, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Natasha, because I study international law here as well. With Christian, I actually have my exams on this. It's very difficult, as you can imagine. And I've read through the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice. In January, they accepted the case, etc. But then in March, or 1 month later, Israel has to hand in a report. We don't know the contents because it's confidential. But then in March, they said unanimously that Israel should not hinder humanitarian aid, should not be obstructed, etc. And they documented the whole dire situation for the Palestinians. But I don't get your point about the whole food trucks, because to me it seems that the International Court of Justice was quite clear in the whole dire situation in Palestine, and that there might be obstruction from the side of Israel. So could you please elaborate on that?
The International Court of Justice misstated the facts, and they were actually called out on this by the Vice President in her dissenting opinions, Vice President Julia Sebutinde. And she was the only one to actually reference CODAT data, which is the data that I've been referring you to. Inexplicably, apart from the fact that we know who was leading the court at the time, the President, Judge Salam, who's now left the court in order to resume a role in Lebanese politics. Before he was President of the International Court of Justice, he was accusing Israel of war crimes and of being a terror state. Now, his rhetoric has become even worse. I invite you to have a look at his Twitter feed in the last couple of days. So in any other context, he would have been required to recuse himself. But that is why you've got the International Court of Justice basing, unfortunately, even these provisional measures orders on a false picture of the facts. Nevertheless, the requirements of these orders have consistently been clear that Israel act to prevent a genocide from occurring, and Israel has consistently been clear that what it is doing in Gaza is not a genocide, and so it is complying with these provisional measures orders.
Can I end asking the two of you, because we asked you already what would happen if the court rules that this is not genocide. Would you accept it if the court rules that it is in fact genocide, what has happened in Gaza?
I'm afraid I can't, because I can see the evidence very clearly, and I can also see consistently how this court has been approaching the facts and the law. The idea that, and we just heard, that the other side is pro-international law, pro the Geneva Conventions, pro-human rights. But what we are witnessing is an inversion of each of those concepts in pursuit of the agenda of internationally prescribed terrorist organizations. And with the International Court of Justice, which has, separately also called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria and from East Jerusalem, and also wiped Israel off of the map when it talked about the contiguous nature of Palestinian territory. This is the court that you are asking me about. It is one that has lost all credibility, and the reason that is so desperate is that ignore Israel right now, okay? Because what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews.
Would it be right to say that both of you, also what you said in the beginning, Trine, are saying that what is happening right now is a question of life and death of the international law system? I mean, if it rules one way, you think this is this is a sign, the proof that international justice has died. If it doesn't, would you say that actually this is a real problem of international justice? What happens in Israel is a real problem of international justice and its future.
This is what happens when you weaponize international law. When you weaponize these terms and these concepts in international law, they become devoid of meaning. This is why what is happening is not just dire for Israel. What starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. You are absolutely right that it is the international legal order that is at stake. Because while it is being manipulated, inverted, and yes, while the world and his wife, Amnesty, the UN, special rapporteurs, yes, we've heard the shopping list of them. They are all wrong because they're all singing off the same hymn sheet. And this is what is doing the most destruction to international law. And for people to profess to wish to uphold it while serving such an active role in its destruction is deeply, deeply troubling to me.
Okay, so Natasha says that this is really a question of the international system of law. It is at stake here. In what way, do you think?
It is, but it's not just because of what Israel is doing in Gaza, but because the whole international society, with Russia's aggressive attack on Ukraine, with the way that the US is now threatening countries to overtake and annex. So there are a lot of big powers around threatening that system, and there are few that actually stands up for it. And the issue of Gaza and Israel's war crimes in Gaza and in Palestine as such is still being questioned, ridiculed. So I think the problem here about that is a very specific issue that, and I'm sorry, Natasha, really, I respect your arguments, they're political, they're not legal. And I also have to say that I really find it quite extremist to say that the only way the international system of laws can save itself is from not judging Israel.
All right.
Okay, because that's the essence of what you're saying.
That's a fundamental misrepresentation of what I just said.
That's exactly what you said.
Okay, then yeah, please answer.
No, I thought, forgive me,
please do it very
very briefly. Well, look, I know I'm in English here and everyone's doing this in English for my benefit, so thank you for that. But I thought I had made myself extremely clear. I am criticising the inversion of international law, the use of these terms as political terms, masquerading as legal ones. It means that they're devoid of any meaning. If anyone can sit here and in the same breath say Israel is guilty of genocide, but Hamas, oh, I'm not so sure, it threatens the very integrity of the international legal system. It means that these are no longer courts, if they are following this suit, but they are political bodies.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming here. Thanks for coming from the UK to join us. Thanks for this, all of you, for joining this debate and putting up with those horrible arguments from the counterparts and misrepresentations and all that. It's been very, very interesting to listen to all of you. Thanks for coming here tonight. Thank you all.